Eleanor stood in front of the mirror, carefully examining her reflection. At 45, she looked elegant. Her navy blue dress emphasized her slender figure, and her hair was impeccable. But her eyes betrayed her anxiety. "Are you sure you're ready?" Richard's voice came from the next room. His tone was cold, almost indifferent. "Yes, everything is as usual," Eleanor replied, trying to make her voice sound confident. "Dinner in honor of my brother's birthday is going to be special." Richard appeared in the bedroom doorway. He was a tall, handsome man with gray hair on his temples. His gaze used to take her breath away. Now she saw only icy detachment. "Who exactly is coming?" he asked, adjusting his tie. Eleanor turned away from the mirror. "Thomas and his wife, of course. Michael and his family are coming." "Ah, your favorite son," Richard interrupted her with a subtle mockery. Eleanor ignored the quip. "And the Andersons will be there too. You remember Robert? He helped you with that contract last year." Richard suddenly tensed. "The Andersons? You didn't say you'd invited them. I told you about it a week ago," Eleanor replied softly, feeling anxiety building in her chest. "Is something wrong?" No, everything is fine," he replied quickly, but his eyes darted around the room. "I just wasn't expecting this." Eleanor walked over to the dressing table and picked up a bottle of perfume, a gift from Richard on their 20th anniversary. 3 years ago, he still remembered such dates. "You know," she said, trying to sound casual, "we haven't talked much lately. Maybe after dinner." "I have a lot of work to do," Richard cut her off. "I'm not sure I can stay for dinner long at all." Eleanor froze with the vial in her hands. 23 years of marriage had taught her to read between the lines. Something was wrong, very wrong. "Richard," she turned to him, "if there is something—" The doorbell interrupted her. Richard instantly left the room, leaving her alone with an unanswered question. Eleanor took a deep breath, trying to calm herself. She felt that tonight would change everything. She just had to figure out how. She took one last look in the mirror, adjusted her earrings, and headed for the living room. It was time to meet the guests. Time to play the role of a happy hostess, a role that was becoming harder and harder for her to play with each passing day. The living room gradually filled with guests. Eleanor moved between them with perfect grace, greeting each with a warm smile. 23 years in high society had taught her to perfectly conceal her true emotions. "Elka, my dear, how good to see you." Eleanor hugged her brother's wife. "Has Thomas arrived yet?" "He's parking the car," answered Elka, a slender blonde with a slight German accent. "Eleanor, you look stunning. Is that a new dress?" "Oh no, it's just that I haven't worn it in a long time." Eleanor noticed Richard throwing a quick glance in her direction. He used to remember every dress she wore. The doorbell rang again. This time, it was Michael with his wife Lauren and their children. "Mom." Michael hugged her, and Eleanor closed her eyes for a moment, inhaling the scent of his cologne, so familiar from her childhood. "You've outdone yourself as usual. The smell from the kitchen is incredible. Grandma!" 5-year-old Olivia threw her arms around her. "My little princess." Eleanor picked up her granddaughter, feeling her heart fill with warmth. "Look how beautiful you are in this dress. Daddy bought it for you," Olivia boasted. "And he said you are the best grandma in the world." Eleanor noticed Richard's face squirm. He had never approved of the way she spoiled her grandchildren. "Eleanor," she heard a voice behind her. She turned and saw Robert Anderson and his wife. "What a wonderful evening you have organized. Robert, Margaret, I'm so glad you could make it." Eleanor noticed Richard turn away abruptly and walk to the opposite corner of the room. "Richard, my friend," Robert called out. "How's our joint project going? Is everything going according to plan?" Richard froze in his tracks, his shoulders visibly tensed. "Yes, everything. Everything is under control." Eleanor felt something cold stir in her chest. She knew this tone of voice all too well. It was how he spoke when he was trying to hide problems. "Mom," Lauren gently touched her elbow. "Are you okay? You look pale all of a sudden." "I'm fine, dear," Eleanor forced a smile. "I'm just a little tired from all the preparations." "Why don't you sit down?" Lauren suggested. "I can help with the serving." No, no. Eleanor shook her head. This is a special evening. I want everything to be perfect. At that moment, Thomas, her younger brother, the hero of the occasion, entered the living room. Sis, he said, opening his arms, you've outdone yourself again. This dinner, all these people, this is your day, she replied, hugging her brother tightly. 50 years is an important date. Eleanor, Richard suddenly called. His voice sounded unusually sharp. Can I talk to you for a minute? She apologized to her brother and went over to her husband. Richard took her aside. Why did you invite the Andersons? He hissed. You know we're going through a difficult time in business, but Robert is your old friend and partner. Eleanor was surprised. And you said yourself that he helped you with— I know what I said. Richard interrupted her sharply, but then lowered his voice, noticing that some of the guests had turned in their direction. Just stay away from them, okay? Don't ask them about their business. Richard, what's going on? Eleanor looked intently into his eyes. You haven't been yourself lately. If you're in trouble— I'm fine. He smiled tightly. You'd better make sure everything's ready for dinner. Eleanor watched him walk away to the group of guests and felt anxiety growing in her heart. Something was coming, something big and unpleasant. She knew it. She felt it with her whole being. But for now, she could only play her role, the role of the happy hostess of the house. Everyone to the table, she announced, trying to make her voice sound festive. Dinner is served. The guests began to move into the dining room. Eleanor paused for a moment, looking at her reflection in the large wall mirror. Hold on, she told herself mentally. Just hold on. But something told her that this evening would be a turning point in her life, and she had no idea how right that hunch was. The dining room looked immaculate. The crystal glasses sparkled in the candlelight, the silverware was in perfect order, and the snow-white tablecloth created a sense of special solemnity. Eleonora personally placed the place cards with the guests' names on them, carefully considering every detail. Eleanor, this duck is incredible, Margaret Anderson exclaimed as she tasted the main course. You have to share the recipe. It's a family secret. Eleanor smiled, noticing Richard nervously twirling his wedding ring on his finger. From my grandmother. Mom has always been a great hostess, Michael added, raising his glass. To the birthday boy, and a wonderful dinner. The guests raised their glasses. Eleanor felt her heart fill with warmth at her son's praise. They have become closer lately, although their relationship used to be tense. Thank you all for your kind words, Thomas stood up. And I especially thank my incredible sister for this evening. Eleanor, I'd like to say a few words too. Richard suddenly interrupted him, standing up abruptly. Eleanor froze. Something in his voice, in the way he clutched his glass, made her shudder inwardly. You know, Richard began, looking around the room, there are times in life when you have to be honest. Absolutely honest. He paused, and the room fell silent. Even little Olivia stopped playing with her napkin. Today is a special day, he continued, and that's why I think it's right to say it now, in front of everyone. Richard, Eleanor said quietly, feeling cold inside. No, darling, he smiled, but it was as cold as ice. Let me finish. 23 years is a long time. Long enough to realize that some things just don't work. Eleanor felt the blood drain from her face. She knew what would happen next, but she couldn't believe it was happening now, like this. Eleanor has always been a wonderful hostess, Richard continued, a slight mockery in his voice. As you can all see. But sometimes that's not enough. Dad, what are you doing? Michael asked sharply. What I should have done a long time ago, Richard answered. I'm filing for divorce, Eleanor. The silence that followed these words was deafening. Eleanor felt all eyes on her. Richard continued, clearly enjoying the moment, she thinks no one knows about her little secrets. About the antidepressants she's been taking for 3 years. About her tantrums when something goes wrong. Enough! Michael stood up abruptly, but Richard didn't stop. About how she follows my every move, checks my phone, makes scenes. Richard. Thomas's voice sounded like a whip. Are you drunk? Oh no, Richard shook his head. I am absolutely sober, And for the first time in years, I'm saying what I think. Eleanor stood up slowly, her hands trembling, but her voice calm. Thank you for choosing this moment, darling. What? Richard seemed confused by her calmness. In all these years, she continued, adjusting the napkin on the table, you have not learned one simple thing. You must choose your moment of triumph very carefully. She slowly looked around the room. I'm sorry, but it seems that the celebration will have to be interrupted. Thomas, I'm sorry that your birthday— Don't even think about apologizing, her brother interrupted, giving Richard a devastating look. Mom! Lauren reached for her, but Eleanor gently pulled away. It's all right, dear. She looked at Richard calmly. You know, I have long suspected that this moment would come, but even in my worst-case scenarios, I never thought you'd stoop to this. What do you mean? Richard's voice sounded alarmed. Oh, you'll find out soon enough. Eleanor turned to the guests. Thank you all for coming. Robert, she looked at Anderson, maybe you and Richard should talk. About business, about investments. Richard went pale. What are you talking about? The truth, darling. The very truth you've been craving today. She took her purse. And you know what? I did check your phone, and your email, and your bank statements for the last 6 months, because a good wife should know where the family savings go, right? The room fell dead silent. Richard stood there with his mouth open, unable to say a word. Now, Eleanor straightened up. I'm going to my office. And if anyone wants to talk about the real secrets, I am at your service. She moved toward the door, but stopped near Richard. And yes, dear, I do take antidepressants, because living with a man who destroyed everything we built together has proven to be a difficult task. With these words, she left the dining room, leaving behind a stunned silence and her husband's pale, chalky face. The first minutes after Eleanor left the dining room seemed endless. The silence that fell in the room was so thick you could cut it with a knife. Little Olivia, feeling the tension, clung to her mother. Mommy, why did Grandma leave? She whispered. Lauren hugged her daughter tighter. It's okay, sweetheart. Everything will be fine. Richard was still standing, leaning on the table. His face was gradually turning crimson. She's gone mad. She's just gone crazy. Really? Robert Anderson slowly stood up. Then perhaps you can explain to me what is happening to our joint project. And what happened to the $2 million from the company's account? It's not what you think. Richard nervously loosened his tie. I'll explain everything. Oh, you have a lot to explain. Michael stood up as well. His eyes were burning with anger. Starting with how you dared to humiliate Mom in front of everyone. Thomas put his hand on his nephew's shoulder. Michael, let's not make any sudden movements. Margaret, he turned to Robert's wife, perhaps you and Lauren could take the children into the living room? The women stood up silently. Lauren took Olivia in her arms. Come on, princess. We'll watch some cartoons on my phone. When the door closed behind them, Elka, Thomas's wife, shook her head. You know, Richard, in the 20 years I've known your family, I thought I knew you. But today— Oh, you know nothing! Richard suddenly exploded. You all see only what she wants to show you. A perfect hostess, a caring mother, a loving wife. Do you know how she spoils my life? How she controls my every move? Does that justify what you just did? Thomas asked quietly. It's her fault. Richard began to pace nervously around the room. If she hadn't meddled in my business— Your business with my money? Robert took a step forward. Is that what you mean? Michael suddenly froze. Dad, what have you done? Richard stopped and ran his hand over his face. It's not like that. There were some difficulties. What kind of difficulties? Robert's voice became icy. The kind that could make our company go bankrupt? What? Michael turned sharply to his father. What is he talking about? Nothing's wrong. Richard tried to make his voice sound confident. Just a little financial maneuvering. Everything is under control. Under control? Robert laughed bitterly. Just like your marriage. Thomas walked over to his son-in-law. Richard, I've known you for over 20 years. We have vacationed together. Our children have grown up together. Tell me honestly, what's going on? For a moment, it seemed that Richard was about to break down. His shoulders slumped, and despair appeared in his eyes. But then he straightened up. Nothing. It's just that your precious Eleanor has decided to ruin everything. As usual. Perhaps that's enough. Michael walked decisively toward the door. Where are you going? Richard asked. To my mom. I want to hear her side of the story. Stop! Richard grabbed his son's arm. You can't. Get your hands off me. Michael's voice was quiet, but it was so threatening that Richard instantly backed away. All of you. He looked around the room. You are all on her side. You've always been on her side. No, Richard, Thomas replied calmly. We just see what's going on, and you know what? I'm beginning to understand why my sister has been looking so tired lately. The dining room door opened, and Elka appeared on the threshold. Eleanor's in the study. She asked Robert to come in. And you, Michael. Richard took a step toward the door, but Thomas stood in his way. No, my friend, you stay here. I think we have something to talk about, too. At that moment, a muffled woman's cry came from the office. Everyone froze. It was Lauren's voice. Oh my God, Michael whispered and ran out of the dining room. Richard sank down on a chair, covering his face with his hands. He suddenly seemed small and old, not at all like the confident man who had tried to humiliate his wife in front of everyone an hour ago. You know, Thomas said quietly, looking down at him, the worst thing is not what you did. It's how you did it. Outside the window, thunder rolled. A storm was approaching, as if nature itself had decided to emphasize the drama of the moment. Eleanor's study had always been her personal refuge. Dark wood paneling, an antique desk inherited from her father, bookshelves to the ceiling. Everything here breathed calm and reliability. But not today. Eleonora was sitting at the desk, a thick blue folder in front of her. Her hands, folded on the folder, were absolutely calm, but her eyes were full of pain. Mom. Michael entered the office and froze in his tracks. He was followed by Robert and Lauren. Close the door, son, Eleanor asked gently. We need to talk. Lauren went to her mother-in-law and hugged her tightly. How are you? I can't believe he... It's okay, dear. Eleanor patted her daughter-in-law on the back. I've been ready for something like this for a long time. What do you mean? Robert sat down in the chair across the table. Eleanor opened the folder. 6 months ago, I noticed that Richard began to behave strangely. Late calls, secret meetings, constant nervousness. At first, I thought he was having an affair. Isn't that so? Michael asked quietly. Eleanor smiled bitterly. I wish it were, son. It's much worse than that. She turned to Robert. Do you remember that big contract with the European investors? Robert tensed. Of course. It was a $15 million deal. Eleanor pulled out some documents. Look at these statements. The money didn't go to the project. It was transferred to offshore accounts. What? Robert grabbed the papers. But how? That's impossible. Unfortunately, it is possible. Eleanor took out another document. This is a copy of the contract with the fictitious company. Richard set it up 3 months ago. All project funds went there. Michael sank into his chair. That's why he was so nervous when he found out that you invited Robert. Eleanor nodded. That's right, she said. He hadn't expected his fraud to be exposed so soon. Lauren leaned against her husband. But why now? Why did he make this scene at Thomas's birthday party? Eleanor stood up and went to the window. Lightning flashed behind the glass, illuminating her silhouette. Yesterday, I sent a letter to the company's board of directors with all the evidence of his fraud. You what? Robert jumped up. Why didn't you tell me? Because I knew you'd try to hush it up, she replied calmly. For the sake of old friendship, for the sake of the company's reputation. Mom. Michael looked at her with a mixture of horror and admiration. Do you understand what this means? Yes, son, she turned to the audience. It means that your father could go to jail. But you know what? He chose this path himself. Oh my God, Lauren whispered. What about us? Eleanor walked over to her daughter-in-law. This has nothing to do with you and Michael. I've taken care of it. All your accounts and assets are protected. I've been working with the best lawyers for the last 3 months. Suddenly, the door opened sharply. Richard stood on the threshold, with Thomas's worried face behind him. You? Richard hissed. You planned all this. Eleanor looked at her husband calmly. No, dear. You planned it all. I was just protecting myself and our family. Family? He laughed hysterically. You destroyed me in front of everyone. No, Richard. Her voice was firm. You destroyed yourself, with your greed, your lies. And you know what? I could have forgiven you for your betrayal. I could forgive the humiliation. But the fact that you jeopardized our son's future, I was in control, he shouted. 1 more month, and I would have taken it all back. Really? Eleonora pulled out another document. What is this, then? An application to transfer all assets to the Cayman Islands? Dated yesterday? Richard froze. His face turned white as chalk. Where did you get this? Oh, you have a wonderful secretary, dear. Eleanor smiled weakly. It turns out that when a woman is heartbroken and not paid the promised bonus, she becomes very talkative. Silence fell in the office, interrupted only by another rumble of thunder outside the window. You've thought this through, Richard whispered. No, she shook her head. I just learned from you. I've learned a lot in 23 years of marriage. For example, that sometimes you have to be 1 step ahead. Richard took a step toward the table, but Michael instantly stood between him and his mother. Don't even think about it, Dad. What now? Richard's voice trembled with anger and fear. Are you going to send me to jail? Eleanor slowly approached him. No, dear. The law enforcement agencies will do that. And I just want a divorce. And you know what? She leaned closer. Now, you will be the one who has lost everything. The storm outside the window intensified, reflecting the storm of emotions raging in the office. Richard stood leaning against the wall as if his legs no longer held him up. All his masks had fallen off, leaving only a broken man. I need a drink, he muttered. Oh, no, Thomas replied sharply. You need to be sober for what's coming next. Eleanor went back to her desk and pulled out some more documents. Robert, these are copies of all the transactions for the last 6 months. It's all here. Dates, amounts, invoices. Your lawyers will know what to do with this. Eleanor. Robert looked stunned. Since the day I accidentally saw a strange transfer on Richard's phone, she sat back in her chair. He had forgotten to log out of the banking app. The amount was staggering. Michael walked over to his mother and stood next to her, showing support. And you didn't tell anyone? Not even me? I couldn't risk it, son. She touched his arm gently. Your father could have denied everything, destroyed the evidence. I needed irrefutable facts. You were spying on me. Richard suddenly exploded. You were going through my things. Eleanor looked at him with a mixture of pity and fatigue. How else was I supposed to protect our family? While you were playing financial games, I was thinking about the future of our children and grandchildren. Lauren, who had been silent until now, suddenly approached her father-in-law. How could you? We trusted you. Olivia loves her grandfather so much. Don't you dare, Richard hissed. Don't you dare lecture me on morality. Thomas's voice sounded like a slap in the face. Who has the right to tell you what you've done? At that moment, there was a soft knock on the door. Elka appeared on the threshold. Eleanor, Olivia is crying in there. She wants her grandmother. Eleanor instantly stood up. I'm coming. She turned to the audience. I'm sorry, but my granddaughter is more important than all this. Stop. Richard took a step forward. We're not done yet. Oh no, dear. She stopped in the doorway. We are just finished. Everything that was between us ended the moment you decided to humiliate me in front of everyone. But you know what? She smiled weakly. I'm grateful to you. You finally showed your true colors. When the door closed behind Eleanor, Robert stood up. Michael, you'd better go with your mother. Your father and I need to have a serious talk. Michael nodded, took Lauren's hand, and started for the door. But he stopped at the threshold. You know, Dad, when I was a kid, you always taught me that a man has to take responsibility for his actions. Well, it's time for you to take responsibility for yours. In the living room, Eleonora was sitting on the couch, holding Olivia close. The little girl leaned against her grandmother, calming down. "Grandma, why was everyone yelling?" she asked. "Why is Grandpa so angry?" Eleanor kissed the top of her granddaughter's head. "Sometimes, dear, adults forget that the most important things are love and honesty. But don't worry, everything will be fine. Really?" Olivia looked up at her with big brown eyes. "Really?" Eleanor replied firmly, looking at her son and daughter-in-law, who had just entered the room. "Everything will be right now." Muffled voices came from the study. Sometimes they rose to shouting, but then they subsided again. The thunderstorm outside the window began to subside, as if nature had decided that there was enough drama for today. Margaret brought a cup of tea. "Drink this, Eleanor. You need to calm down." "I am calm," she replied, still stroking her granddaughter's head. "For the first time in many years, I am absolutely calm." Suddenly, the door to the office burst open. Richard ran out without even looking in their direction, and a moment later, the front door slammed. "Mom!" Michael sat down next to him. "It's okay, son." She took his hand. "It's just time for the truth. For all of us." The next morning, Eleanor's house resembled the headquarters of a crisis center. Robert was on the phone with lawyers, Thomas was flipping through documents, and Michael was nervously pacing the room. The doorbell rang and everyone froze. "I'll get it," Lauren said, but Eleanor stopped her. "No, dear, I'll get it." A young woman in her 30s stood on the doorstep, elegantly dressed, with impeccable makeup and an expensive handbag. "Mrs. Williams?" Her voice trembled slightly. "I'm Victoria Pierce, your husband's secretary." Eleanor stepped aside. "Come in, Victoria. I've been expecting you." Michael tensed. "Mom, are you sure?" Eleanor led Victoria into the living room. "Mrs. Pierce has something to tell us." Victoria nervously clutched her purse. I don't know where to start." "Maybe from the moment my husband asked you to become more than just his secretary?" Eleanor asked calmly. Everyone in the room held their breath. Victoria turned pale. You know? I know more than you think." Eleanor sat down in her chair. "I know about the apartment he bought you 3 months ago, about the joint business trips to Europe, about his promises to divorce me and start a new life." Victoria suddenly burst into tears. "He said you didn't love him, that your marriage was long dead, that as soon as he settled things with the company, and you believed him?" Michael asked quietly. "At first, yes." Victoria took out a handkerchief. "But then I saw the documents. I realized what he was doing with the company's money, and when I asked him about it—" "Did he threaten you?" Eleanor stepped forward. "Yes," Victoria whispered. "He said he would make sure that no one would hire me again, that everyone would think it was me who stole the money." Robert put the phone down. "Do you have proof?" Victoria unzipped her purse and took out a flash drive. "Everything is here. Copies of documents, recordings of conversations, photos. I started collecting this when I realized he was just using me, just like everyone else." Eleanor added quietly. "Mrs. Williams." Victoria looked her in the eyes. "I know I have no right to ask for forgiveness, but I want you to know that I didn't know about his plans to run away with the money. When I found out—" "You came to me," Eleanor finished, "and I am grateful to you for that." Michael stood up abruptly. "Grateful? Mom, that woman—" "This woman just helped us put the final nail in your father's coffin," Eleanor interrupted him. "And believe me, son, she was used just like the rest of us." Victoria sobbed. Yesterday he came to me. He was drunk, shouting that you had ruined everything, that now we would fly to Cayman together." "And what did you say?" Thomas asked. "I said that I would not fly anywhere with him." Victoria straightened up. "And that if he didn't leave me alone, I would go to the police." Eleanor suddenly approached the young woman and took her hand. "Listen to me carefully, Victoria. What you did today was a very brave thing, and I promise you that we will protect you. But Victoria started to cry again. "I destroyed your family." "No, my dear," Eleanor smiled sadly. "Richard destroyed it, with his greed, his lies and his betrayal. And you just became another one of his victims. Robert took the flash drive. This will help us a lot. Mrs. Pierce, you'll need to speak to our lawyers. I'm ready. Victoria nodded. At that moment, Thomas's phone rang. He looked at the screen and frowned. It's the police. Richard was detained at the airport. He was trying to leave the country. Eleanor slowly sank into her chair. That's it. That's the end of the game. Mom. Michael walked over to her. Michael, are you okay? You know, son. She looked out the window, where the bright morning sun was shining. I feel relieved, as if a heavy burden had finally fallen from my shoulders. A week passed. Eleonora was sitting in her office, sorting through the mail when the phone rang. The number was unknown. Yes, I'm listening, she answered. Did you think you could destroy me? Richard's voice sounded unusually calm, and that's what alarmed her the most. You are not allowed to contact me, she replied in a flat tone. He laughed. Oh, there are many things I'm not supposed to do, but you know what? If I fall, I'll take you with me. What do you mean? Look at your email, honey. I sent you a little surprise. Eleanor opened the mailbox and froze. There were several photos of her house taken this morning. One of them was of Olivia playing in the garden. Are you following us? Her voice trembled. Oh, not just watching. You know, I have a lot of friends left behind, and some of them are very upset about the way you set me up. Is that a threat? It's a warning. His voice hardened. Withdraw your lawsuit. Withdraw the police report. Or what? She tried to speak calmly, though her heart was pounding. Or your fine reputation will be destroyed. Do you think everyone will believe the story of a poor betrayed wife? What about your own secrets? About your antidepressants? About your visits to a psychiatrist after a miscarriage 15 years ago? Eleanor felt a cold sweat break out on her back. You wouldn't dare. Yes, I dare. And this is just the beginning. What do you think people will say when they find out that the perfect Eleanor Williams tried to commit suicide? That she had been hiding her instability for years? At that moment, the office door opened and Michael entered. When he saw his mother's pale face, he was instantly at her side. You know what, Richard? Eleanor suddenly said calmly. Do whatever you want. Publish whatever you want. But remember one thing. You have no power over me anymore. You'll regret it, he shouted. Yeah. She hung up the phone. Her hands were shaking. Mom? What happened? Your father decided to take revenge. She showed her son the photos. And it looks like he's not alone. Michael immediately pulled out his phone. I'm calling the police. This is a violation of the restraining order. Wait, Eleanor stopped him. Call Lauren first. Tell her to pick Olivia up from school and go to her parents' house, at least for a few days. Do you think he can... I don't know anything about your father anymore, she said bitterly. The man I had known for 23 years was an illusion. There was a knock at the door. It was Victoria, pale and anxious. Mrs. Williams, Richard just sent me a message. He's threatening to... I know, Eleanor interrupted her. He called me too. What are we going to do? Eleanor stood up. What he least expects. We'll fight back. She went to the safe, opened it, and took out another folder. I suspected it would come to this, so I prepared something. What is it? Michael asked. Insurance. She opened the folder. It's proof of all his fraud over the past 5 years, not just with Robert's company. And you know what's most interesting? There are documents about his connections with very dangerous people. Where did you get this? From his former partner, the same one Richard framed 3 years ago. It turns out he was collecting information too. Just in case. Victoria stepped closer. I can confirm this. I've seen some of these documents. Eleanor picked up her phone. Time to make some calls. And you know what, Richard, she whispered. You're really going to regret putting our family in jeopardy. Mom. Michael looked at her with concern. You have to be careful. He's dangerous. No, son, she shook her head. I'm the one who's dangerous, when I'm protecting my family. That evening. Eleanor's living room turned into a makeshift crisis center. Thomas was on the phone with the security company, Robert was consulting with lawyers, and Michael and Lauren were sitting next to Eleanor. The security cameras will be installed tomorrow, Thomas said after finishing the conversation. And there will be round-the-clock surveillance too. Eleanor smiled weakly. I never thought I'd live to see the day when I'd need protection from my own husband. Ex-husband, Lauren corrected firmly. He has lost the right to be called your family. The doorbell rang. Michael tensed. I'll get it. An elderly woman with graying hair and penetrating eyes stood on the threshold. Good evening. I'm Margaret Black, your new neighbor from across the street. Eleanor stood up. I'm sorry, but now is not a good time. I know, the woman interrupted her. I worked for 30 years as a police officer, and I saw that man taking pictures of your house this morning. The room fell silent. Come in, Mrs. Black, Eleanor invited. Margaret sat down in a chair. I can see everything from my window. And do you know what? There is a group of vigilant neighbors in our neighborhood. We watch out for each other and help each other. And you've come to offer help? Thomas asked. That's right. Margaret nodded. My friends have already been warned. Any suspicious movement near your house, and we'll call the police right away. Eleanor felt tears coming to her eyes. Thank you. But why? Margaret adjusted her glasses. Because I know what it's like to live in fear of your own husband. 30 years ago, I went through the same thing. And if not for the support of my neighbors... At that moment, Eleanor's phone rang again. An unknown number. Turn on the speakerphone, Margaret said quickly, and record the conversation. Eleanor did just that. I'm listening. Well, my dear, have you thought about my proposal? Richard's voice sounded almost cheerful. Yes, I have, she replied calmly. And you know what? I'm not afraid of you anymore. Oh, yes, you are, he laughed. Do you know what I found in the old papers? Documents about your treatment. I wonder what the charity foundation where you work will say when they find out that their esteemed director... Try it, Eleanor interrupted him. Publish everything. Do you know what will happen then? I'll tell my story, how I survived the loss of my child, how I fought depression, and how my husband used it against me instead of supporting me. You wouldn't dare. Yes, I would. And you know what else? I have a recording of this conversation, of your threats, your blackmail attempts. You... And there's something else, Richard. Her voice turned icy. You lay one finger on our family, and I will make everything public. Absolutely everything, including the documents about your dealings with the Moretti brothers. Silence fell on the other end of the line. How do you know about the Morettis? His voice trembled. And you thought I only knew how to cook? She smiled bitterly. In 23 years of marriage, I've learned to gather information as well as you. You're bluffing. Check it out. Publish something about me, and the next day everyone will know where the money from the sale of that land in the suburbs really went, and why Giovanni Moretti's wife suddenly died. You can't know that. Yes, I can, Richard. And I do. Now listen carefully. Forget about us. For good. Because I won't be so merciful next time. She hung up the phone. The room fell silent. Mom, Michael whispered. Is it true? About Moretti? Eleanor leaned back tiredly on the sofa. Not all of it, but Richard doesn't know that, and his fear of them is stronger than his hatred of me. Margaret Black nodded in approval. A clever move. Use his own fears against him. I just want to protect my family, Eleanor replied quietly. And you did. Margaret stood up. And now you have an army of protectors. He will not come near this house again. Lauren hugged her mother-in-law. You are the strongest woman I know. No, dear. Eleanor shook her head. It's just that sometimes life forces us to be stronger than we thought we could be. That night she couldn't sleep for a long time. She looked out the window at the lighted street, where a patrol car drove by from time to time, the result of Margaret Black's call to her former colleagues. And for the first time in many days, she felt something like peace. Her phone beeped. She had a message from Victoria. He just bought a ticket to Mexico. Looks like your bluff worked. Eleanor smiled. Sometimes the best weapon is not the truth, but a skillfully created illusion of the truth. 3 months passed. An autumn morning filled Eleanor's kitchen with golden light. She was sitting at the table, looking through the morning mail, when she heard a familiar, sonorous voice. Grandma, look what I drew. Olivia flew into the kitchen, waving a piece of paper. The drawing depicted a smiling woman wearing a crown. "It's you!" the girl proudly declared. "You are the queen now, aren't you?" Eleanor laughed. "Why queen, dear? Because Daddy says you are your own boss now, and whoever is his own boss is a king, or a queen." Wise words. Michael came into the kitchen. "Good morning, Mom." Eleanor kissed her son on the cheek. "You are early today." Lauren went to a conference, so the princess and I decided to have breakfast at Grandma's. And we did the right thing. She stood up. "I've just baked a cherry pie. It smells delicious." Victoria appeared in the doorway with papers in her hands. She now worked as Eleanor's assistant at the charity. "Oh, Vicky!" Olivia was delighted. "Are you coming to our pie party too? If you're inviting," she smiled. "Of course you are." Eleanor took out another cup. "What's the news?" Victoria put the papers on the table. "The divorce papers have been signed. It's final." Eleanor froze for a moment, feeling something tremble inside. Not pain, but rather relief. "Have you heard from him?" Michael asked cautiously. "Last I heard, he was somewhere in Mexico," Victoria replied. "After the Morettis started asking about him, he decided it was best to disappear. And he was right to do so," Michael muttered. Eleanor put the pie on the table. "You know, I don't want to talk about him anymore. It's the past. And we have a future." "And what is it like, this future?" Victoria asked. "Beautiful." Eleanor smiled. "Yesterday, the board of directors approved our new project. We are opening a support center for women who have experienced domestic violence." "Really?" Victoria's eyes shone. "So you've agreed?" "Yes. You know, sometimes the best thing we can do with our pain is to use it to help others." Olivia, who had already smeared cherry syrup all over her face, looked up. "Grandma, are you happy?" Eleanor looked at her granddaughter, at her son, at Victoria, who had turned from a friend in misfortune into a reliable assistant and ally. She thought about Margaret Black, who calls every night to check on her, about Thomas and Elka, who come over every Sunday for family dinner, about Robert, who entrusted her with a seat on the board of directors of his company. "Yes, dear," she replied. "Now I'm really happy." At that moment, the doorbell rang. Margaret Black stood on the doorstep with a basket of apples. "Good morning. I thought maybe you would like to bake an apple pie." "We already have a cherry pie," Olivia proudly announced. "Oh, then I'm just in time," Margaret laughed. "You know what's better than one pie? 2 pies," they all answered in chorus. Eleanor watched her kitchen fill with laughter and conversation. Once upon a time, this house seemed like a golden cage where she played the role of the perfect wife. Now it had become a haven for a new family, a family of her own choosing. In the evening, when everyone had left, she sat in her office, reviewing documents for the new center. There was an old photo album on her desk, and she finally decided to open it. 23 years of her life captured on paper. "You know what I realized?" she said to her reflection in the window. "Sometimes you have to lose everything to find yourself." Her eyes fell on Olivia's drawing of a woman in a crown, and she smiled. Perhaps her granddaughter was right. She had indeed become a queen, the queen of her own life. And outside the window, the autumn day was burning down, promising a new dawn and new opportunities. Opportunities that Eleanor was now ready to accept with an open heart.